So yeah, good to see so many people here. One or two familiar faces and familiar names there, but for those of you who don't know me, yeah, as Lizzie says, I'm a CELTA and Delta tutor, and first and foremost, a teacher. But the idea for what I'm going to talk about today came to me through a couple of things that happened on CELTA courses earlier this year. The first one happened it was in a face-to-face course, and part of the course we send the CELTA trainees around the school to observe some of the teachers working at our school in London. And the way it works with the timetable, but they always go after the break, so they see the final hour or so of the lesson that they observe. And after one of these observations, one of the CELTA trainees came to me and he said, "Can we sometime get to see the first part of the lesson?" And I said, "Yeah, maybe you can do that. Why?" And he said, "Well, the lesson we watched was great. It was really exciting. The students were really engaged and there was lots of energy. And at the end, I said to the teacher, 'That was great. Are your lessons always like that?' And the teacher said, well, only after the break." And I thought, well, that's a bit, really? Do you only do that kind of activity after the break? Is that only a end of lesson thing? I don't think it is for me. I think I would do that kind of thing at any point in the lesson. And then there was another thing that happened on a different course where we were doing feedback after teaching practice. And one of the CELTA trainees had taught a lesson where he'd done a big kind of free practice, productive activity. And then after that, he'd finished the lesson for about the final 10 minutes with a more kind of controlled practice activity as a kind of recap of the main target grammar from the lesson. And I thought that was really effective. I thought that worked really well. But then when we were doing feedback on that, one of the other trainees in the group, who was possibly the strongest trainee on the group, or in fact on the whole course, he had some experience and he'd done lots of reading as well, obviously. He suggested that he didn't like that structure. He suggested that it would have been much more logical to do the controlled, restricted activity first before the big productive task. So I said, okay, I can see your point there, but I found that quite effective. And I don't think that it's illogical to have the productive bit followed by a more controlled, restricted task. Now, I imagine some of you are probably thinking, oh, that's task-based learning. That sounds like task-based learning, but this isn't a talk about task-based learning. I'm neither a proponent nor an opponent of task-based learning. Clearly, I'm aware of task-based learning, and I have been for a long time. So that's obviously had some kind of influence on my teaching practice, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. I don't think I've ever really set out to do a task-based learning lesson, but at the same time, being aware that there is this approach, this method out there that says that why not do the production first? In fact, you should do the production and freer use of language first before you get to any kind of clarification, focus on form, explicit language teaching. That must have had some kind of influence on the fact that I tried to do that at some point in my teaching career and continue to do it. And I think it works the other way around as well, that through whatever way I ended up doing this kind of thing quite often in class, it's nice to know that out there is a fairly recognized, solid approach with lots of supporters that agrees with that. It's always nice to have that as you develop as a teacher, and I've been teaching for over 20 years. I certainly don't teach in the same way now as I did 20 years ago. I would imagine, I'd hope, that those of you who've been teaching for a long time also have developed and don't teach in exactly the same way as you always have. But so it's always nice to know that there is this something out there. It's not just these habits you get into or these things that you develop. They're not just your weird thing that you do, but there is some theory behind it out there, even if it wasn't yours. And that's important, I think, isn't it? But whatever you do in the classroom, a lot of it is a case of what works for you. And again, the longer you spend in teaching, the more you realize that there isn't just one way of doing things. There isn't just, there is very little consensus on what is the only way of doing things. There are so many different opinions. There's so many different ways of interpreting the different assessment criteria that there are. and so many different opinions about what those criteria should even be in the first place. So I think that's the thing to kind of just, as you keep developing as a teacher, whether that's through just your own experience and practice and reflecting on that, whether that's through other courses you do or qualifications you get, whether that's through attending things like this or reading you do, or through observing other teachers, or by being observed and getting feedback on what you do, all great ways to keep developing as a teacher. It's important to realize that there are so many different ways of doing things. But one thing that I think is important, and just to say also, because that's why I'm always very wary when I'm giving advice to teachers of saying, always do this or never do this. Because you can be sure if you say that, there's someone out there who's very well qualified, very knowledgeable, very well experienced, who thinks the opposite. So that's, again, another thing to bear in mind. But one thing that I think is quite important is to be careful about your lessons becoming too predictable, and to be careful of falling into a very set routine. Now, there's a quote I've got here, which some of you may recognize. If you recognize this quote, it may be because this quote actually appears quite near the beginning of the book Teaching Unplugged, which is the Dogme book. This isn't a talk about dogma either. Again, I'm not a proponent or an opponent of dogma, but again, it's clearly another thing that has influenced me one way or another. So this idea that you can't or you shouldn't be in a fixed routine, and maybe this makes it sound quite complicated. It's not really, but I think it's an important thing to bear in mind. Some of you might be familiar with this quote, not because it's from Teaching Unplugged. If you are, it's not originally got anything to do with ELT. This quote was originally from Bruce Lee. So there we go. But this idea of avoiding a routine, I think this is very important, because I feel, and I think I've noticed that a lot of lessons that go on, not all lessons, but a lot of lessons go on, there does seem to be a kind of an understanding, almost an acceptance, both from the students and from the teacher, that the lesson is going to be a series of exercises, and you're going to work through these exercises, and at the end there'll be a treat, there'll be a reward at the end. Maybe you'll have a game, or you'll do a mingle, or a role play, or a discussion, or a debate, or make a presentation. All nice things to do, but it seems to be the sense that that's the end bit, and it's almost an acceptance of just get through the exercises, the main bit of the lesson, most of the lesson, just a sense of get through this. And again, just as an aside, whenever I hear teacher tell the students, for your next exercise, my heart does sink a little bit, because that doesn't sound like much fun to me, an exercise. Task, I don't find the word task, to be honest, much better. I don't want to do a series of exercises and tasks. That doesn't sound like fun to me. And it doesn't have to be. It can still be fun. It doesn't have to be this predictable, almost slog through the stuff you need to do with the treat at the end. So what I'm suggesting is nothing radical. It's nothing revolutionary in terms of what you actually do in the classroom. Really, it's just giving more priority to the fluency activities, the freer use of language throughout the lesson, and especially in the early stages of a lesson. And I mean, I've got various reasons it is important. I think the first one, which is central to everything, is the more quickly you get the students fully engaged and involved, then they're going to stay fully engaged and involved. And so when you get to the harder bit, the more challenging bit, the most important bit, if you think that's what the most important bit is, then they're going to be more engaged, they're going to be more involved, more switched on, more present. When you get to that bit, whatever that may be, you may just be doing a traditional grammar lesson with a particular grammar area you want to get to. Great, they'll be more engaged when you get there. They may be tackling a difficult reading or a listening test. And I'm sure that everybody tends to do a lead-in, a warmer, engaging with students, but it's often very, very short. It's often very brief, 5 minutes at the most, and then the exercises come out. So my suggestion is, why not make more of this and make it, as big a part of the lesson as you can. Get the students full of energy, full of enthusiasm now, rather than just with the promise of the bit at the end, the fun bit later. Make it all like that. And then crucially, the more engaging and the more production you can get early on in the lesson, the more this provides the context for everything that comes later. Again, if it's a particular grammar point you're doing, then contextualizing it early on means that when you come to it, the students are much clearer about what the language is for, when this might be needed, what kind of situations this language is going to be used in, because you've already created that. And so everything that comes later becomes more meaningful and more memorable, importantly, as well. In a similar way, I think this works as a diagnostic activity, both for the teacher and for the students, which is really important. So for the teacher, you get an idea again, if you're building towards a particular language point, you get an idea of how much the students know already. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you do this and then it turns out the students, you know it quite well, you don't have to scrap your whole lesson and do something else. But what it does mean is that you don't end up spending a long time going through things that the students already know quite well. And this does happen quite a lot. Quite a lot of time is spent clarifying and doing controlled practice of language the students are quite comfortable with. And they don't need the exercises. What they need is to be pushed to use that language more freely and then to get feedback on what they've done with the language. On the other hand, sometimes this kind of activity can alert you to the fact that this genuinely is new. The students really don't know this. That's quite rare, but that's quite exciting when that happens. And then you know you really do need to spend a bit more time and a bit more care and attention, because unusually this really is new. And then obviously it works for the students as well. From a student's point of view, it alerts them if it really is something that's new. If it really is something that the students aren't familiar with, when you then get to the clarification part, they know what they need, they know what they want, they know what it's for. It's the language that you didn't know earlier on. It was when you were trying to say that thing and you weren't quite sure how to say it, this is what that's for. And so again, it makes everything that comes later so much more important and meaningful for the student. Now, another point which is important is obviously the more productive activity, the more fluency-based activities you have, the more emerging language is generated. And so the emerging language, the language that just comes up, not your pre-planned language. And again, this is so important. It's obviously important for the students. It's often, again, the most meaningful, memorable language because it's language that they genuinely needed at that moment. And again, as a teacher, it's a really useful thing to be able to work with. I often say this to teachers, and I know it's very easy to say, but when you're teaching, and especially if you're being observed or assessed, one of the things that's going to most impress your observer, your assessor, is how you exploit this emerging language. But the first thing you need to be able to do is actually create the opportunities for the language to emerge. And I've seen lots of lessons where you can't really say much about this because there hasn't been any, because everything has been so restricted. And so there's been little or no emerging language other than just answering the questions, responding to the controlled tasks. Another thing kind of related to classroom management side of things is when you have different levels of ability in the class. And you're always going to have this, maybe not extreme, but in any class, there are going to be different levels of ability. You're always going to have your stronger and your weaker students, your faster finishers, and so on. And again, I'm sure we all have strategies for dealing with the faster finishers or stronger students, whether it's, putting a stronger student with a weaker student to do the peer teaching, or whether it's an extra challenge for the faster finishers, or getting the faster finishers up to the board to write answers on the board while others are still working. All of these things, but it all still means that the class is separated at these moments. And clearly this shows up more in more restricted activities. The more restricted these activities are, the more these different levels of ability show up. And no matter how great you are with your differentiation strategies, there's always going to be some students who wish that activity had finished a little bit earlier, and other students who wish that activity had gone on a little bit longer. The freer the activity, the more open the activity, the less this becomes a problem. It's not the kind of activity where the stronger students are just finished. They can work together. Yeah, the different levels of ability are still going to be apparent, but it doesn't mean that the students can't work on it as a group, as a whole, rather than everyone doing different things at different paces. And this, as it says, it's going to help you with the pace of the class and the motivation and the engagement of the students. If I ever hear a teacher saying that they're struggling with having lots of different levels of ability within their same group, the first piece of advice I would give them is don't do so many controlled practice, or don't do so many restricted activities. This kind of thing will allow the students to work as a whole. Now, another important point, without going too much into different theories of second language acquisition, of which there are many, but I think one point which I definitely would agree with is that accuracy is a later stage in language acquisition. So this idea that students need lots and lots of accuracy practice and consolidation before they can go and do the freer practice, the production, I don't think that's valid. I don't think that's logical. And I think you're preventing students from really developing either. I think, I'm sure we've seen can think of lots of examples of students who improve their fluency a lot, whether that's just by speaking a lot in the class or speaking a lot outside class, just generally speaking a lot. And as the fluency improves, the accuracy does kind of follow a bit behind, not at the same speed, but the accuracy does follow along. Yeah, there'll still be some fossilized errors perhaps here and there, but the more fluent you get, the accuracy does follow. I'm not saying as teachers, obviously, we can still help with further clarification, focus on form, that kind of thing, but it does follow. But it doesn't work the other way around. Students who only work on accuracy don't magically become more fluent as well. And I would argue without that fluency, the accuracy only gets you so far. It's never as well or as fully consolidated without putting it into use, without the fluency work. Now, another point related to classroom management, which I think is quite important, is that sometimes we run out of time, and sometimes we don't even get to that last bit. And if that's the treat at the end, you don't get to it. You've broken that contract, that kind of unwritten contract that get through the exercises and we'll do something fun at the end. Sometimes that doesn't even happen. And if that's the only bit of your class which is really focused on fluency, if that's the bit that your whole class has been building towards, and then you run out of time for it, that's a really big omission. And then you might think as a teacher, oh, well, I'll make sure I do that tomorrow. But then you might think, well, I can't do that at the beginning of the lesson tomorrow. That wouldn't be logical. So we'll do the exercises and just try extra hard to get time for the production tomorrow. And sometimes you will, but again, you might run out of time another time, and it almost becomes this cycle where sometimes they don't get the treat, sometimes they don't get the production. It's kind of jam tomorrow, if you're familiar with that reference. So that's the idea of making sure that not just saving it till the end, having it all the way through, one, just to make sure that you actually do get it at all. And then a final thing, which I think is very important, fun. And let's not overlook how important it is just to have fun in the classroom, to make the lessons fun. If the more the students enjoy it, again, the more meaningful and the more memorable everything that happens in the class will be. Sometimes I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but sometimes I feel like the world of ELT is a lot more serious than it used to be. There's lots of focus on assessment criteria and learning objectives and CEFR descriptors and can-do statements, and that's all well and good. They're all very important. But I remember when I first started out, when I was doing my Trinity TESOL, And as part of that, our tutor would kind of model different activities for us, which we would all do. And then at the end, we kind of have the recap where we talk about what made these good activities, or why should we do these in the classroom. And we would all be very keenly saying, oh, because it's a great way of personalizing the language, and it's a good way of consolidating understanding, and we use all 4 of the skills in that activity. And then the final part would always be because it's fun. And that in itself is a really valid reason to do something in the class, making the lessons fun. There is another quote, in fact, from the Teaching Unplugged book, which I particularly like, where they're describing what makes a good unplugged lesson. And they say, before it's a language lesson, it should be a social event. That's, we can aim for that. We can aim to create that kind of environment in the class. And in my social events, we don't do exercises and tasks very much, but we do things that are fun. So that's something to aim for. So I've not got any kind of practical tips here in this talk, in that I'm not suggesting, as I said, anything particularly revolutionary in terms of the kind of activities that you do. By fluency activities, again, it could be like a very structured task, as in task-based learning and so on. It could be a more just natural conversation style of interaction, as in dogme. It could be any of the kind of role play type activities that I'm sure you'll see in lots of resource books around, or the kind of things you see in the extra activities in the teachers' books. Whatever, I'm not suggesting anything radical in terms of the kinds of activities. I'm just saying give them more importance, give them more priority in the class, and don't just see them as an extra thing. So just in terms of what exactly I mean, or what exactly I understand by a fluency activity, what makes something a fluency activity, I'd say the crucial thing is that they require a context. So that could be a very personalized context, so the students literally talking about themselves or their own experience, their own opinions, their own lives. Or it could be a much more, an imaginative context. But as long as the students know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, why, what the situation is, what they're trying to achieve, and what they're trying to achieve in that moment is not to practice language. That's the important thing that makes it a fluency activity. So along with that, another important thing is that fluency activities will involve meaningful and authentic interaction. So again, whether it's genuinely expressing an opinion, sharing an experience, finding something you have in common with another person, or whether it's pretending to interview someone for a job, or whether it's reporting, whatever it is, it's meaningful interaction. And then as a result of that, really importantly, it's going to require meaningful use of language. So by that we mean like discourse, genuine discourse, not lists of words, not a series of sentences to practice or model a particular structure, but yeah, genuine, meaningful use of language, which is the end in itself, not just to practice something. And so that's the idea that within this, the activity cannot control or restrict the student's choice of language. Yeah, when you're setting it up as a teacher, of course, you can give prompts, you can give guidance, definitely. You can give some kind of language input before the task, you can pre-teaching, feeding forward, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, you can do that. But then during the activity itself, what's important is that the students are using whatever they have at their disposal to communicate and express themselves. But as a result of that, clearly, they may produce unpredictable language, but that's not something to be afraid of. That's something that is going to be ultimately particularly beneficial to the students. So whether you decide to go purely in the kind of dogma task-based learning approach, where whatever language comes up, that becomes a target language for your lesson, or whether you use that on top of or alongside whatever the preset language goals you have for the lesson are, that's a thing that's definitely beneficial, this kind of unpredictability of what may come up. So that's what I understand by fluency activity. And now some people may consider it would have been more logical to have said all this at the beginning. but I think it's quite a nice way to end. And one final thing I'm going to end with, which is another quote, not from the world of ELT, but some of you may be familiar with it anyway. And that quote is, logic will get you from A to B. Imagination will take you everywhere. That quote, of course, was from Albert Einstein.